The Washington Post today dropped this huge story. It's more of a small book, really, about the Russian attack on our presidential election last year and how the Obama administration came to recognize that that was happening, what they understood about it, and importantly, how they reacted to it once they realized what it was. In just a moment, we are going to be joined live by one of the reporters who broke that story, and there's a lot to talk to her about. This story today at the Washington Post, it's like 10 front page worthy scoops all in one big story. And among the scoops the Washington Post got for this report is that U.S. intelligence agencies somehow have access or had access to a source of intelligence that was very, very, very close to Vladimir Putin. And that is intriguing just on the surface, right? Just for the pure spy novel, lurid thrill of it. We've got somebody close to Putin or something close to Putin, right? The Post, to its credit, I think makes clear how extraordinary that is beyond just the wow factor, how unexpected it is to learn that, ultimately how important it is to U.S. interests. The Post today notes that Putin is, quote, a former KGB officer who takes extreme precautions to guard against surveillance. He rarely communicates by phone or computer. He always runs sensitive state business from deep within the confines of the Kremlin. But nevertheless, the U.S. somehow got access to intelligence, got access to information that apparently could only have come from very close to him. According to the Post, U.S. intelligence agencies' sourcing when it came to attributing an author, when it came to attributing blame for the Russian attack, their sourcing came from, quote, deep inside the Russian government. Deep enough inside the Russian government that what they had intelligence about, what they had a report about, was the direct, personal, individual involvement of Vladimir Putin in directing this campaign. I mean, Putin is a guy who's so secretive, Russians were not even allowed to know the names of his children until recently. Or, in fact, that he definitely had them. When he got divorced in 2013, half of Russia was like, he was married? But somehow U.S. intelligence agencies have sourcing inside the Kremlin about his personal involvement in Kremlin covert activities. That's a big freaking deal. I have no idea what that intelligence source is, but that is a big deal. And it is remarkable, honestly, that the Washington Post has been able to report that. The nature of the source of that intelligence, the danger the source of that intelligence must be in if that source is a human source. I mean, that's just palpable, right? How do you think Putin reacted to reading this in the Washington Post today? I mean, the sensitivity of the United States having an intelligence source so close to Putin, that is apparently what drove a lot of the extreme secrecy within the U.S. government about what the intelligence agencies knew concerning the Russian attack. The Post has some incredible details on that today, including them shutting off all of the monitors, like the TV screens, shutting off all of the monitors around the Situation Room in the White House when senior officials were meeting to discuss these matters. They hadn't shut down all the video monitors in the Situation Room for anything since the bin Laden raid. But they did it for this because they considered it to be so sensitive and so secret. The sensitivity of the source of America's intelligence on this subject, the prospect that that source might conceivably be a human being who is in personal contact with Putin, I think that drives home for us as Americans just the incredible sensitivity and human dangerousness of some of what our intelligence agencies know, right? Sort of makes you get viscerally why it's so important that that kind of information shouldn't ever fall into the hands of anyone who, say, is beholden to Russia for some reason. So that is one of the things the Washington Post unveiled today. Such a sensitive thing. It's almost impossible to believe that we get to read about it in the paper. I should tell you, though, their sources for this report, according to them, are, quote, more than 3 dozen current and former U.S. officials in senior positions in government. So presumably, they've got this nailed down, right? More than 3 dozen sources? It's a remarkable thing that they've been able to report out today, but with that many sources, presumably they have nailed it. In addition to that incredible scoop about the source of this intelligence being so close to Putin, there's also a bunch of really other specific information that we never really knew before that tells us a lot more as citizens about what happened to us last year. They describe, for example, the FBI and the State Department noticing and getting alarmed about an unusual spike in requests from Russia for temporary visas for officials with technical skills seeking permission to enter the United States for short-term assignments at Russian facilities. I mean, that's astonishing, right? I mean, so FBI and the State Department are alarmed. An unusual spike in requests for Russians with technical skills for short-term projects here right before the election. I want to know, how do they notice that? Like, do they have algorithms that process requests for visas that tell them when anything spooky and spy-like pops up? Or did one person be like, hey, weren't there like 3 other guys named Sergey who were applying for this same visa? Anyway, how did they notice that? How did they know about the tech skills of all these Russians who were trying to get into the country for short-term assignments right before the election? So that's an incredible detail. The Post also reports somewhat ominously that the Russian attack on our election was not entirely remote controlled. And I don't know if this relates to the part about all the Russians with tech skills trying to get in on short-term visas, but the Post reports today that the Obama administration believed that some of the Russian attack last year, at least some of the people who participated some way in that attack, were Russians who were not in Russia. They were Russians who were physically located here in the United States when they were helping in the attack. So that obviously previously unreported. I don't understand exactly what that means and how much of a handle the Obama administration and now presumably the Trump administration had on who those Russians are or were. Again, there's a ton in this story from the Washington Post. I'm very much looking forward to talking with Ellen Nakashima about that in just a moment. It's not just a collection of granular little scoops like these ones I've been talking about, though. There is an overarching framework to what the Washington Post has reported today. And basically, the big question around which they frame all this new reporting, and it's a question that I think we all have to admit will loom large in history about this time in our country, which is, how did Russia get away with this? Not just what did Russia try to do, but how did they get away with it? Especially now that we know that various parts of the U.S. government were able to conclude confidently not only that the attack was underway while it was underway, but they knew who was doing it. How did they get away with it? How have they continued to get away with it? I should tell you that NBC News has an exclusive story out just tonight about the Trump administration and how they have done nothing, how they have taken little meaningful action since Trump has been in office to shore up U.S. defenses against Russian hacking, to protect our elections infrastructure in particular, let alone to retaliate in any way against Russia for having done what they did in our election last year. Now, depending on how you feel about the Trump campaign and their own special relationship with Russia on this issue, the news that they're doing nothing to try to prevent it from happening again in the future, and they're doing nothing to respond to Russia having done it last year, that may or may not be surprising to you. But why did the Obama administration not do more than they did once they realized what was going on? This big report from the Post, it hints at the U.S. government having a lot of options if they really did want to go after Russia, if they really did want to retaliate and hit Russia in response for what they did. Specifically, there's some new and very provocative news in this Washington Post piece where they describe what sounds like rather epic American capacity for hitting Russia using cyber tactics. And I'm being a little vague about this because the Post is a little vague about this, but this is new. The Post is newly reporting that before he left office, President Obama approved a covert measure that, quote, authorized planting cyber weapons inside Russia's infrastructure, the digital equivalent of bombs that could be detonated if the United States found itself in an escalating exchange with Moscow. That work was started under a covert authorization signed by President Obama before he left office. In the 5 months since he left office, though, that work apparently has continued on the basis of President Obama's authorization. Now, the Post does not say exactly what kind of damage this new capacity the U.S. is developing, what kind of damage it could inflict on Russia, or even what types of Russian infrastructure these things might be targeting. But, you know, even before this previously undisclosed covert program to develop new ways to hit Russia, even before this, the U.S. has previously been clear that whatever the Russians can do to us in terms of cyber attacks, or whatever the North Koreans can do to us, or the Chinese, or anybody else who devotes massive state resources to developing this capacity, the U.S. has been clear in the past that they believe that our NSA, our cyber command, has more firepower in that regard than any other country on Earth. And whatever any other country can do to us, we can do to them, and much worse. There's no lack of confidence within the U.S. government that the United States has the power to inflict devastating consequences on Russia or any other country if we chose to do so by cyber means. Why didn't they choose to do something like that when the Obama administration recognized what Russia was doing with our election? Particularly when they realized it wasn't some freelance operation, wasn't some criminal operation. It was being deployed directly by the Russian government on the orders of the Russian president. Again, we're going to talk with Ellen Nakashima from the Post about this in just a moment, but the way the Post lays it out, they give basically two types of answers to that question. One of them is domestic to the U.S., and it is sort of exasperating to think about a national security matter like this having domestic political constraints about it, but that's the way it is. The other one is not domestic, though. It's a different kind of constraint. That's the keep you up at night kind of thing. But the domestic political constraint that the Post describes was apparently about Donald Trump making it a touchstone in his campaign that the elections were somehow rigged for Hillary Clinton. When he was saying that the elections are rigged, the whole thing's rigged, he wasn't saying the Russians were rigging our election. What he was saying was that the U.S. government, right, the Obama administration, or maybe even the Clinton campaign, the Democrats were somehow rigging the election to favor Hillary Clinton. And because he was campaigning on that, the political consequence of that in terms of this national security issue is that the Obama administration apparently felt constrained in terms of how dramatically they could respond to this attack and how much they could even talk about exactly what they knew the Russians were doing. Because with that stage having been set by Trump, this is all rigged, they want to interfere in this election to help Clinton. With that stage having been set in terms of our domestic politics, the Obama administration believes that whatever they said and whatever they did about the Russian attack on our election would have been called, you know, proof of what Trump's been saying all along. They've made up this story. This is how they're going to rig the election and steal the election for Clinton, and they're going to blame it all on this Russia thing. So that was the constraint driven by domestic politics. And I think it's not purely craven, right? The other thing you have to think about when you're the president of the United States, when you're public servants and intelligence agencies serving the good of the people of the United States, that you don't want to end up in a situation where a significant portion of the country thinks they've got great reason to believe that we didn't just have an election, right? That it was all rigged, that it was stolen, and they should, you know, turn to some other means to install their leader, right? You don't want to mess with that. So they tried not to. And they felt constrained in their response to the Russia attack because of that worry. That was the domestic constraint. The other constraint they apparently felt is something that is like less sort of exasperating about our politics and sort of just more straight ahead scary. According to the Post's report, one of the reasons, the other main reason the Obama administration, quote, ruled out any pre-election retaliation against Moscow is because they feared what Putin might do in response about the election. They feared that Putin, quote, was prepared to go beyond fake news and email dumps. Quote, the FBI had detected suspected Russian attempts to penetrate election systems in 21 states, and at least one senior White House official assumed that Moscow would try all 50. Michael Daniel, who was cybersecurity coordinator at the White House, tells the Washington Post that, quote, we turned to other scenarios that the Russians might attempt. Quoting from the Post, as brazen as the Russian attacks on the election seemed, Obama and his top advisors feared that things could get far worse. Moscow's meddling to that point was seen as deeply concerning, but unlikely to materially affect the outcome of the election. Far more worrisome to the Obama team was the prospect of a cyber assault on voting systems before and on Election Day. Worrisome to the Obama team was that prospect. So part of the reason they didn't throw everything they had at the Russians, which appears to be a considerable amount of stuff they could have thrown. Part of the reason they didn't do anything to Russia about this before the election was because of how it would play politically here in the United States. This question, an important question of whether Americans would have confidence that our election was not being rigged by the outgoing administration in order to install somebody who'd been Secretary of State in that administration as the next president. Right? There was that domestic concern. But the other part of their reticence to do anything before the election was driven by the fact that they believed, apparently, that Russia could blow up the election if they wanted to. That beyond the bots and the propaganda and the stealing the documents from the Democratic Party and releasing them in a way designed to cause damage, beyond all of that stuff, which we all know about now, apparently the Obama administration believed that whatever Russia did with the voter rolls and all those probes of election systems and all the other poking around that they were told they did in counties and in dozens of states before the election, the Obama administration apparently believed that maybe the Russians were capable of melting the whole thing down on Election Day. So Americans couldn't vote, or the votes couldn't be counted, or the vote could be disappeared or changed in some catastrophic way. Learning that that fear is part of what constrained the Obama administration's reaction. Honestly, that's the way we learned as a country today, that the Obama administration apparently believed that Russia could do that Russia had that capacity. They could have absolutely blown up our election if they had wanted to. And if they had that capacity last year, presumably that means they still have it for whenever they want to use it. So there's a lot that the Washington Post has just broken here. Like I said, it's like they took 10 page one scoops and they put them all in one big story. With that fascinating framing in terms of how the Obama administration responded. We're going to be speaking with reporter Ellen Nakashima from The Post about that in just a moment.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.